Right, welcome everybody to the middle presentation of our midday session. I'm delighted to be joined by two colleagues of mine, Liz Maina or is it Maina? Is it pronounced Maina?
No, Maina, perfect
Okay,
pronunciation.
I thought that I had it right, but well, it's always good to double check. And Njoki Ngumi, welcome both. We got connected through Sam Reynolds. I know that you were looking for, I think it was through Njoki actually, was looking for somebody who could spend some time taking a look at some Kenyan astrology. And Sam recommended we chat, and we've been in communication ever since and have worked on a couple of projects together. I think this is our third project together, which has been nice. Can
Yeah,
I ask you both to introduce yourselves to the group? Maybe we can start with
abs
Liz.
okay. Hi everyone. My name is Elizabeth Maina. Or Liz. I live and work in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm a cultural practitioner. That's what I've been doing over the years. I've recently started working in feminist philanthropy, which I find very interesting. And I also have a growing interest in astrology, but my focus more is on research. I still don't understand like the transits and the effects yet, and it's been really fun learning alongside Wade and Jockey.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Liz. My name is Njoki Ngumi. Like Liz, I'm a cultural practitioner, also living and working in Nairobi. My background is in healthcare, and it seems pretty organic that from that particular viewpoint, an interest in astrology kind of grew together with kind of blooming into more of the arts and culture. So I've just been kind of growing my knowledge slowly and expanding, trying to understand like the infinities that astrology expands into. Like everybody, you kind of start out from a very kind of personal natal understanding, and then you kind of start understanding that the patterns go far beyond that into much larger contexts, including the world, and especially around our election, which was about 2 years ago is when I started becoming really interested in seeing how those patterns work for entities such as nation states. Even though I'm not a fan of borders, never have been, but it's really good to just kind of see the way these things work out and see then what can we understand about the way these patterns work and how they reflect in the lives, our own lives and the lives of our communities, especially communities that are vulnerable to significant changes, so that when we understand time in this way better, we hope that we're able to be a little bit more resilient and hopeful, actually, is one of the main things. And so
Wonderful.
this is why yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think there's a slight delay. So perfect. Yeah, we were talking together a couple of months ago, trying to figure out, what did we want our next project to be on? And something that I believe it was Liz brought up, World Bank. World Bank has been a topic on everyone's lips for some time. And actually, around the time that Liz, you had mentioned the World Bank, I was doing my own research into it. So it was just a perfect kind of fold. So maybe we can start with talking about what the World Bank is. I'm not sure that everybody's going to have, full context.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me kind of guide us through that. I do want to give the disclaimer that I am not, by any definition, an economist, nor do I have a banking, commerce, or finance background. So I really kind of prepared that with that in mind. And if there are economists and people with banking, finance backgrounds, please forgive if you feel like it's a bit of a kindergarten-y approach. I just kind of wanted to not have very many heavy technical sector-specific terms in this regard. So in essence, what the World Bank is a provider of finances that's kind of owned jointly, and I use the word jointly very loosely, in general by the 187 classified countries of the world. Again, 187 is a give or take number because different countries are recognized as states in different ways for different reasons by different parties. But in general, the countries of the world own the bank together, and its purpose is to serve as a bank with each individual country as a customer. They're supposed to be able to give finances to different countries for their different needs, especially to be able to grow their capacity to trade, to earn income, and to ideally, again, very much in quotes, equalize the economic status of the world. The original intention of the bank was to kind of rebuild specifically Europe after the Second World War. And maybe what I can do is kind of remind us what is needed for there to be production. These are called factors of production, and that would be land, labor, capital, and what they call management, or the driving force that enables production to happen. This would be production of goods and services, which can then be kind of sold on the market for then people to be able to earn money, and not just people, but communities, countries in general, and national economies. So as you can see from the images, after the Second World War, and this would be in the mid-40s towards the 50s, Europe's infrastructure, of course, was decimated. So much destruction had gone on. There had been so much death. It's important to remember what the context of the rest of the world, especially like in Africa, there was still colonization actively happening, and our countries and what had been defined as our countries by these European colonizing entities were still under that kind of violent oppression and subjugation. So that was also happening in that context. Europe were here having lost access to land in many ways, having lost access to their labor force, having real limits as regards their capital. There were even countries that were using cigarettes as currency. Like, it had really gone bad. And of course, there was no real guidance as to how they were going to get back their national economies. And so you can just kind of see from the images, things were really bad. There had been all these bombings and what have you. So we can just go to the next slide. It's important to remember again that war created all of these challenges with the flows of resources that can then enable countries to have stable economies and to be able to grow these economies. Those are not the priorities of a wartime government. The priority of a wartime government is to survive a war. And so now we have to come back to a peacetime. That's when people can now start thinking about, oh, the economy. We remember that we had that. So as regards the idea of promoting economic recovery and then kind of inoculating these wider economies from future iterations of such huge shocks, right? From the instability that comes with war and the direct effects of the war. There are several global institutions that were put together. One of the first ones was the United Nations, which was kind of a global attempt at putting everybody around one table and simulating equality and being able to talk about diplomacy and having conversations before to kind of be a stopgap to prevent a third world war, because the devastation of the Second World War had been at that point in time unforeseen. And then there was the twin institutions, what are called the Breton Woods twins, and they're called Breton Woods because that's the place where they were just kind of put together, were the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was interested in being able to put together what is needed to make sure that there's infrastructure in different countries, make sure that you raise the quality of living of the people. So that's increasing a labor force. And then you had the International Monetary Fund, whose main purpose was to be able to stabilize the currencies of a country to make sure that there's cash flow. So they were kind of focused on the capital element of putting together the factors of production. So they were very much two institutions that were kind of holding hands to jumpstart and catalyze the growth of economies after this horrible time. So please remember that the World Bank was initially started to restart Europe's economy. That's really important to remember because that's really in its DNA. And that was the intention of it starting. Right now, there's the whole, oh, it's supposed to be a global thing, but originally the priority was always Europe.
You can see this embedded, if we can just go back for a moment, in the United Nations logo. This is not the current logo of the United Nations. The original logo of the United Nations had the USA centered in the logo. With the idea here, really, I mean, for the first time in a couple hundred years history, there was a superpower. I mean, we had British naval might, for instance, Portuguese trade. I mean, there have been periods where empires have really risen. But to the level that the USA emerged coming out of World War II, we hadn't really seen anything like it. And you can see just in such small things, like even the logo of the United Nations, the original one, how it was very US centric and on the terms of the United States as it was being built and its primary partners. Its special relationships with European nations were quite focal. There was, of course, an intent to also rebuild Asia, but there just were not the same kind of allied relationships in the destroyed parts of Asia that there were in Europe. It led to very different outcomes and realities. Yeah. Now, if you're curious, the United Nations logo doesn't center the United States anymore. It centers the Prime Meridian, which effectively centers London and Western Europe. So it was supposed to be more neutral, but we still have to ask why we're centered on the Prime Meridian. What was that about? Okay, wonderful. And so you were mentioning, Njoki, about the Breton Woods Conference, and that was originally called the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. This was before the United Nations actually existed. The United Nations was still, I think, a year out, but this phrase, United Nations, was a real buzzword kind of phrase at the time. So what can you tell us about this conference?
The really interesting thing about this conference was the fact that the US and the UK were very much the leaders of what was going on. There had been a lot of conversations around how do we rebuild, coming from all of these countries whose flags are represented here. Even if you see South Africa, please remember that at that point in time, South Africa was in the throes of apartheid style government. So it was not by any definition like a Black-led agenda or a majority-led agenda. It was very much guided by what their priorities were then as a government. The thing that ended up happening was all of these people kind of gathered and putting forward all of these presentations as regards what they thought would facilitate and catalyze the world kind of being able to rebuild, anything that would help them be able to partner and trade, anything that was going to be able to help them stabilize, especially currencies, which essentially means making each currency valuable within its jurisdiction and making it a tradable element. And so these are all of the conversations that ended up happening. In general, what ended up as the result was a very kind of US-led and guided agenda with a lot of input, specifically from the United Kingdom, even though there was contributions from everybody, and there's all these, there's a lot of paperwork in the archives to that effect, but in general, it was very much a US-UK agenda. There were two main economists who were a very big deal in this conference, and their names are here. The first one was from the UK delegation, and his name was John Maynard Keynes. He was an economist and a very important one in the world at that point in time. The thing that he was known for was the ability to understand what's happening in an economy, especially during a depression. And his whole thing was look beyond people and individuals. When we're thinking about the idea of demand within an economy, you have to think about demand from the perspective of a government as an entity that can contribute demand to a market. You have to think about the people, and then you also have to think about businesses and private sector, and that together they do a thing that's called aggregate demand. And so he was known for taking a macro view, and as such, he's called the father of macroeconomics. There's a lot of people who, of course, disagree with his viewpoints, but at that point in time, it was really important because his whole thing was you can't trust the free market at a point in time when there are so many other moving parts, especially during political instability. And so he said, if you strengthen the ability of a government to kind of have a finger in the pot of the free market, you can reduce the shocks, whether it's supreme highs or supreme lows, and then you can control things like mass unemployment and what have you from the perspective of a government. And so things then will not be as unpredictable if you take this macro view as they would if you were looking at things a little bit closely. So that was John Maynard Keynes, and he was from the UK. Harry Dexter White is a much more is an interesting entity. He worked for the US Treasury. It's important to note that he's descended from Lithuanian immigrants. He even changed his name from Wait, W-E-I-T, to White, obviously to anglicize it. At some point, he was also accused of being a spy for Russia. Specifically, one is left to wonder whether that's because of his origins or because of the way he was acting. Nobody's really sure. Anyway, he was not as shiny as Keynes on the kind of global stage of economics, but he was really interested in the idea of positioning the US as the giver of credit and positioning the US as a global superpower. And so you can really kind of see his fingerprint in the understanding of what credit to everybody else was going to look like. And you could see how his conversation, together with that of John Maynard Keynes, eventually ended up with what are called these twin institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So the Monetary Fund, which was very much Harry Dexter White's baby, kind of focused on the idea of stabilizing currencies and making sure that there was capital flows. And then John Maynard Keynes, who was really interested in reconstructing of global economies after huge depressions, having had the experience within the UK and then just kind of expanding it to the rest of the world or Western Europe, as it were. He was much more interested in how do we then make all of these economies healthy so that they can start trading again. So this is where these two are coming from.
Yeah, they have a very interesting contradicting lens here. You know, they're on the same side of a hegemonic conversation in a way. But, you know, Britain was destroyed and completely decimated in a way that the US really couldn't properly appreciate for themselves because no part of the war had hit US soil. So with Maynard Keynes, I mean, there was this concern about stabilizing currencies, making sure that regional economies had what they need to get themselves back online, and of course, what happens, you know, in a federated area of many allied nations, smaller nations with, you know, a lesser imprint in terms of GDP, certainly in the 30s and 40s, coming together. You know, I think you can read some of the material and almost get the opinion that when talking with the US in this particular context, that John Maynard Keynes was very much trying to take a more communal approach, but really, even still, it was this recognition that the UK didn't have what it needed to stand on its own 2 feet, and it might have taken a very different path if it could have. And so John Maynard Keynes really took on the debtor lens, you know, wanting to make sure that when we owe money back to the United States, or whoever the creditor nations are, how are we resolving these currencies right now? You know, the regional currencies in Europe are so up and so down that, you know, a payment can be absolutely achievable for 1 year, and then an economic tailspin could result in default the next year. So John Maynard Keynes actually proposed creating, you know, a third-party currency called a bancor that, you know, just something to trade in that was not tied to any one currency. And Harry Dexter White responded, "No, don't worry about that. We're quite happy for you to use the US dollar." So the US dollar at this time, it's important to remember, was still tied to gold. In 1971, when Nixon would untie the US dollar's value to gold, this would effectively put an end to the official constraints around this system, and it would need to be rethought. But this is the lens that we're looking at here. Is the American delegation was very interested in figuring out how to use their capital to make more money. So we made a lot of money, let's make more. There had been quite an economic boon, as everybody knows, related to war manufacture and this recognition that we shouldn't just reconstruct what was there before, which is really what Keynes was arguing for. We should develop on top of it and have new expectations of where capital can flow through our economies. It's interesting to take a look at their natal charts, and what we'll do is we'll take a look at their birth charts and compare it up against the lunation that preceded the Breton Woods conference. So as Njoki said, Maynard Keynes, he revolutionized economics with his theory about government intervention, and the idea that with a macroeconomic view, economies can be stabilized. There's an opportunity to step in to, you know, turn around downturns effectively, figure out how to work even if it means running a deficit, realizing that sometimes, you know, just as it is in individual households, it makes sense to run a little bit in debt if in the long run it helps level things out. Conversely, in good times, and this is, an important part of his story that doesn't necessarily get reflected in the reality of the economics that come from Keynes, is that when we're in good times, this is when we're saving money and we're curbing inflation, we're paying back down that deficit so that we can normalize. So the idea is that we wouldn't have a period that was as economically destructive as World War II, but we may not also have a period that is so disproportionately wealth producing that the wealth runs away and doesn't get redistributed back into economies one way or another. Now, you have to remember that these men were working in very different worlds than the ones that we inhabit today. Billions of dollars of wealth were not being sat on. We had wealth that was tied to material assets, and so there was true limit. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't still very extreme examples of wealth and extreme examples of poverty, but they do have a bit of a different perspective. We'd have a confirmed birth time for John Maynard Keynes, and this is the birth chart for this man that we're looking at. He's born on a Venus-Neptune conjunction in the midheaven. I find the economic story that he presents, the one where we're talking about consolidation, we're talking about government intervention and the benign influence that can come from the government. Is this Venus-Neptune conjunction in the midheaven. Lynn Bell's pointed out that the Keynes chart is being activated by this year's Jupiter-Saturn squares. Absolutely true. And also the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction, which will happen right over his Venus-Neptune conjunction. So we will also this summer have a Jupiter-Mars-Saturn square in August. Mars and Jupiter will be at 17 degrees of Gemini, so that will hit right on his new moon, on his Mercury, which rules Keynes' second house, rules the 11th, and is placed in his 10th. And then Saturn will be at 17 degrees of Pisces on the 8th. So Lynn, I think that that's a very important point to make in terms of Keynesian economics and what is and isn't working out in the world. Lynn concludes by saying it may reflect the intensification of conflict over debt and spending in the coming year. Absolutely. There's still so much about Keynesian economics that exists. I mean, it's still very, very deeply embedded in nearly every organization. I find the really heavy emphasis on Gemini, Taurus, and Cancer to be a highly commercial trio. Aries is fairly commercial as well, in the sense that Aries is strongly associated with themes of new build. So if you work in real estate development, reconstruction, Aries is very strongly associated with these things. But Gemini is, obviously a high commercial, high transaction type of sign. Venus, I think, whenever we're talking about land development and what's happening with land politics, it's going to be important to pay attention to what's going on in Taurus and the Earth signs. But Cancer, let me just make a quick point about Cancer. Keynes had Jupiter at 6 degrees of Cancer in his birth chart, right on the US Jupiter, right on the US Venus. And so in a way, Keynesian economics was also a real boon and, to the US aims. You can really read it that way if you like. But Cancer has also got a strong association with commercial ties and fostering international cooperation for international trade. The reason being that Cancer historically is associated with trade that took place at seas, and in the earliest part of our history, it was easiest for us to load things up on ships and trade in that way, rather than trying to carry things over land, which was significantly more complicated, slower, and more expensive. He does have the South Node in the midheaven, and I don't think that we can really discount that, because I think we're still living through images of what that South Node may look like. I want to show you the position of the Breton Woods astrology, which is in the center now. So this is the new moon that took place just before the Breton Woods conference. And Keynes' birth chart placed right on the outside. So you can see that once again, we have such a strong emphasis on Gemini. I think with the Gemini theme in the 9th house, this is for Keynes in particular, his number one issue was, how does money move across nations? How is it valued internally? How is it valued externally? And how do we get things back to a level of stabilization? very different than the American psyche, which is trying to drive forward. I think in terms of who could have been sent from the UK delegation, Jupiter's placement up on the midheaven, the Keynes Jupiter on the midheaven, it shows that, you know, Keynes was the right person for the UK to have sent, at least in terms, when I say right person, I mean that in the context of, you know, this is what they saw as a real blessing to their argument and to their cause, was somebody with his intelligence. And financial management of Jupiter in Cancer is a very important theme. You'll notice that Keynes is ascendant at 25 degrees of Leo. It was being approached by a Mars-Jupiter conjunction that would perfect just hours before the World Bank was officially you know, kind of created, if you like. It was a recognition. The World Bank, also, just to say, its original name was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This is the World Bank today. It's gone through you know, new naming. And so this Mars-Jupiter conjunction is going to be something that we want to pay very close attention to because of the focal way in which it builds on Keynes's ascendant, but not just his ascendant, but how it figures into Henry Dexter White's birth chart. We don't have a confirmed time for Henry Dexter White, so we're not worrying about the ascendant or the midheaven, but we can take a look at how his chart interacts with the Breton Woods conference chart. Notice that there is, once again, a very strong Mars-Jupiter theme. You can see that the moon is making an application. Harry Dexter White. Is it Henry? I think it's Henry, sorry. He had the, I called him Henry David White, Harry David White, every combination of, you know, everything. So we'll go with what's written. I'm sure that's correct. But he was born on a Moon-Mars conjunction, and this Mars-Jupiter conjunction was forming in opposition to this placement. And it's also worth pointing out that his own Jupiter is placed here. So, you know, there's an image here that, you know, Keynes was the superstar on the ground. There's no, you know, two ways about this. At the Bretton Woods conference, Keynes was the superstar. He had the status. He was internationally renowned. He was, you know, very, very wise and studied and his subject according to, you know, the rules in play for the British Empire. You know, this is how this is being approached, is that he had the answers. You know, Henry Dexter White didn't have that star power. He didn't have that sense of, this is, you know, we're really championing with somebody who, you know, he was a Treasury secretary and assistant, but he did lead the US delegation. But you can see that there's not quite the same themes of, you know, impressionability on those who attend the Bretton Woods conference. You can see in the slide why Keynes would, you know, earn a certain amount of deference, and Henry Dexter White might fade a bit into the background as a result. Right. So, you know, I think this leads us into a discussion about the astrology of the World Bank chart itself. So the World Bank, as we said, was originally called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, would later become the World Bank. You can see that at the time that this came into being, we're looking at a lunation chart, because of course we don't have the exact time. So if we want to pay attention to what's going on with the angles and, you know, how this is configured, the lunations are very important. I just want to take a brief moment just to add to this idea of why I know I use lunations quite a bit, and I have received questions of, you know, why do you feel so comfortable relying on them? Because they do run for 2 weeks, you know. When you study Aries ingresses, there's comments in Ptolemy's work and later astrologers that we take a look at the newer full moon that precedes it. It's almost as if what's happening with the moon shows the, you know, the popular situation through which something emerges. So it gives you almost like, you know, what is the layout of the environment, the background, and how do we understand, you know, what was gestating at the time where this idea was born. So we have a particular moment that something comes out of potentiality, becomes reality, but this lunar kind of approach gives us a wider berth, I think, on the different themes that are in play. I find it interesting to pay attention to the placement of, Moon and Sun in opposition in Capricorn and Cancer. Again, this axis is very strongly related to trade, particularly international trade. Cancer is associated with foreign investment as a result of the fact that it has long-standing association with ocean trade. But Capricorn being, half land and half yes, so Lynn Bell's made a point that the bank officially came into being December 27th, 1945. That is the chart for when it was ratified and signed on by the founding member nations and moved forward. This is the chart for how it was arrived at in the middle of this conference, which then everybody would work towards for the next year and a half. Where was I with this? Capricorn, half land. It's the sea goat, right? So half land, half ocean. So it, has a signification over ports and places where things are coming off the land and into the water, or vice versa. There's a strong association here as well with the sun, which is the exaltation ruler of the ascendant. We've got Venus ruling the second in very close configuration. But I think it's probably more powerful to take a look at how at the founding of the World Bank, which is really what Henry Dexter White wanted, because the IMF became responsible for stabilizing currencies, which was Keynes's big, this is what we want to make sure that stable currencies are stable. And Henry Dexter White said, right, but we want to make sure that we can invest in development. If we plant money in different nations around the world, we want to see that come back, and make money off of this development. And when you take the US Sibley chart off of in the background of the World Bank's like almost imagining or inception chart, not its beginning, as Lynn says, this is, its first actual action doesn't happen until the 1945-46. But at its inception, you can see such a strong US signature on this. You can see that it was actually a solar return for the United States, the Jupiter and Venus conjunction on the fourth house cusp, showing that growth and restoration and investment in land, investment in foreign nations was very much the key focus point. Jupiter ruling the ninth house, but also the fourth, kind of representing, infrastructure and land projects in general. But interestingly, this Mars-Jupiter conjunction is formed at the time that's in opposition to the US moon. And the World Bank, no matter how much handholding there was and excitement about the World Bank's formation, there was, over time, increasing speculation about what was really happening at the World Bank, what decisions were being made, and are there purposes behind the World Bank work that actually maybe undermine or subvert the intended purposes of the organization? It's a very strong 12th house theme, this message of subversion. And the 12th ruler, but also the 11th ruler and 10th. So where we get this Saturnian influence of, national sovereignty, lending from that sovereignty, but possibly also undermining behavior, secret agenda, things that are not publicly made known. Saturn from the US chart, angular here on the 7th, which I think also kind of speaks to the, if we take a look at the 7th houses, the debtor nations, or those on the other end of the deal, for instance, who are accepting money from the World Bank, the conditions and the heavy weight that would often come with this. They are, in some respects, these loans that come from the World Bank, they're a bit like golden handcuffs. They get you out of this problem and create three at the same time, which means you have to go back. And it continues to create, it's not just a debt cycle. What we will be talking about today is that actually the more difficult and insidious form of wealth distribution that happened on behalf of the World Bank, it really came in the demands to restructure economic systems it was the conditions that were put. If you're going to accept this money, you're going to accept our terms. And again, this is, a very Saturnian kind of element of reorganizing the administration of what ought to be sovereign nations, but now are changing their national processes to accept international money. international in quotes. This is very much US led. The weight that the US has in the World Bank is so disproportionate that it would take a major coalition of the other member nations to even be able to challenge dollar for dollar what the US is putting in and expects to get out. So let's talk a little bit about the divisions of the World Bank and Njoki, because when this started, it was just the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. If somebody Googles the World Bank now, they're going to get very confused at how now it's a group. And what are these individual components? You're muted, by the way.
So this happens to be all the time. So there are five entities now that are what is called the World Bank Group. The first one is what was originally called the World Bank, which is this International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And its work is to give loans, so like more market level loans to what are called middle income countries and credit worthy low income countries. It will understand why that demarcation is necessary. So these are like loans the way a bank would understand loans. They're the ones that you expect them to be paid back. You have interest rates that are making sense at a bank level. The kind of money that the kind of money where people are expecting to make a profit. So this would be the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Then there's the International Finance Corporation. So now these are the people who are bringing in how the private sector understands this huge kind of financial deals and understanding. So it makes sure that private sector at the macro level can further its interests in investing in foreign direct investment. Of course, I mean, there's a lot of shadows here, understandably, but this is what's going on. And the World Bank does need large injections of money from the private sector and from multiple other places. They don't only get their money from kind of membership fees and loan repayments. They have a bunch of different funnels of income coming in. So then there's the third one, and this is in order of when they were formed. So of course, the first one was this International Bank for Construction. The next one was the International Finance Corporation. So the third one to be formed was the International Development Association. And so this is why I was saying that there's a difference between the loans from this one and the loans from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The ones from the International Development Association are very much about grants, super low interest loans, especially for people who are really challenged on the side of, are they even going to be able to pay some of this money back? Also, what they need to do with this money, especially if you're coming to do like a reconstruction after a war. Like you literally, there's not even an idea about where you're going to get this money to come from. So they needed this organization to kind of do that. Then the last two are as regards facilitating the way this money is going to move up and down. So the first one is the Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. Of course, there's going to be fights as regards these large amounts of money coming from these large entities and these large coalitions of people. So they needed an entire part of the organization to deal just with conflict resolution, so that then not everybody throws everything into the air and sets fires and begins another war. So you really needed some people whose only work is to make sure that nobody is fighting, and if they're fighting, we can figure it out. And then the last one is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. So giving money in this way is a really risky affair for the people who are giving money, because again, you don't know what's going to happen to a government. You can give money to people and then tomorrow there's a coup, suddenly everything has changed, people have lost the papers, all of those things that kind of happen. And so the Investment Guarantee Agency, its work is to kind of share out the risk, especially as regards the different political issues that can happen as regards the people who are receiving, whether it's grant money, loan money, investment money, and to make it easier, especially even for private sector, these people in the International Finance Corporation and wherever it is that the money is coming from, people like the ones who buy the World Bank issued bonds, things like that, to just make sure that the risk is shared out. So it makes sure that they kind of equalize the risk across the board. So this is what the World Bank Group consists of right now.
Wonderful. So yeah, when we talk about the World Bank, it really could be any of these arms. We're probably talking about a handful of them most likely, but it could be really any of these arms. Now, in the 70s and 80s, there was, global economic meltdown, effectively. There's quite a lot to bring strain and difficulty on the global economic system. And the World Bank, was expected to step up and respond to this. So let's set the stage a little bit as to what was going on in the 70s and 80s. Liz, I understand that you've got, some thoughts on this.
Yes, exactly. So a couple of crises happened that had a global ripple effect that then led to the golden handcuffs situation, as we described it earlier. There was the end of the Breton Woods system where gold was no longer used as the backing for currency, and this led to currency volatility. There was the oil crisis of 1973 and 1979, and this led to a skyrocketing of oil prices and inflation, especially in countries like African countries. There were high levels of debt in developing countries across the world, and this was also made worse by the oil crisis that I just mentioned. There was the stagflation, the phenomenon of stagnation and increased inflation in developed economies, sorry. And this challenged like the conventional economic policies that had been advocated and advanced earlier. There was also a case of increased interest rates, especially in the United States, which further strained all these debt-laden economies, especially in developing countries. So to deal with this, this multiple crisis, a meeting was held called the Washington Consensus, which proposed about 10 market-oriented policies which were aimed at stabilizing the economies. I won't go through all of them. I'll mention just a few. There was an emphasis on fiscal restraint. Fiscal restraint also meant that there was advice that governments, countries should only prioritize spending on critical areas, like more public goods like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. In addition to this, there was also the need to expand the tax collection base while also reducing the rates of higher taxes. This to me is very interesting because African countries, this is definitely not how it goes. We're told to expand our tax collection base and we have increased taxes, which is just a hot mess. And then, of course, there was an insistence on opening up markets for foreign direct investment and also privatizing of state corporations to allow either private-public partnership or outright private ownership that would then mean that no more subsidies, no more cushioning of like key economic sectors by governments, that they're all subject to trade liberalization. So what happened next was the introduction of a credit facility known as the structural adjustment programs, which were prevalent all over the world. The first country to join, to get a structural adjustment facility was actually Mexico. Several Asian countries also got these structural adjustment facilities. And actually in Asia, this led to the creation of the paper tiger phenomenon, where Asian countries had a big economic boom because of injecting resources into their manufacturing and industrialization sectors. The idea for these facilities, which will now be known as the Structural Adjustment Program, SAPs, was supposed to respond to the debt crisis that a lot of these countries in the larger majority, as we know it, were experiencing. And they had three ideas: to reduce government deficit, liberalize trade, and encourage foreign investment by stabilizing the economy, improving efficiency so that these countries are then able to pay back their international debts. The key component of every structural adjustment program always include fiscal austerity. This is reduced government spending and increased efforts to collect government revenue by expanding tax bases. Monetary tightening by reducing inflation, or rather not reducing inflation, but rather controlling it to a manageable, yes, I often can't, anyway, let me move on. Price liberalization by allowing the market forces to determine what prices are, especially in key sectors like agriculture, and privatization, like I mentioned earlier, selling of state assets to private investors so as to increase efficiency, and also reducing government regulations so as to encourage business activity and investment, and especially around foreign direct investment.
Yeah, this seems like there's a bit of a, a bit of a struggle here because the program is really meant to help raise the economic reality of a nation, and it seems like the only factors that were really taken into consideration are what would show up on an Excel spreadsheet. Not that that existed at the time that the SAPs were created. We were still using dot matrix printers, I think, in around this time, or they would have been new and exciting. So, what ends up happening is we see these policies where we are saying, okay, you need to spend less in your government. And at this time, the kind of things that were being spent on were healthcare, education, transportation, your services that you count on a nation to provide to help facilitate trade and to facilitate a certain standard of living in the first place. But we go ahead and cut there, and at the same time, we open you up to a market that you've not really been prepared for. So now, for instance, if you are a producer of a particular grain or cereal commodity, we are going to liberalize your market to the point where we can open you up to an international market, and prepared or not prepared, you will have to respond to international pricing and figure out what that means for you and your and your local economy, and whatever the social effects of this seem to be the fallout, right? I mean, that wasn't really part of the conversation or measured in any meaningful way. So while it seemed like, the intention of the SAPs, because on one level, you think if we're giving money to a nation who needs it, and maybe if we've seen evidence of continually needing injections of cash to keep things running, you might think, okay, well, we probably need to get some things in order. Maybe there hasn't been a lot of stability at the national level. So you can almost appreciate a desire to have a conversation about how we restructure the way that government runs in a local economy to possibly reduce the risk of hemorrhaging cash. So if the money comes in, it's used. The issue is that these came as top-down constraints. They were top-down demands that came onto these unique economies. And they are unique economies, but they were treated as if they were all the same. So the SAPs that were being landed, down in East Asia had many of the exact same targets and expectations as the conditions that were tied to loans that were given to sub-Saharan African nations, or any SAP bound nation around the world. So the reality of the SAPs were very different, I take it.
And just to add that a key thing that has been missing, especially when they when they've been reviewing like the effects of the structural adjustment programs over the years, was the fact that the cultural and political context, especially in Africa, was never taken into account. Yes, exactly. The common man in Nigeria knew SAPs as the start of untold poverty. That's absolutely true. And one of the reasons that I really wanted for us to discuss this was how SAPs have come back, especially like in African nations, and in more insidious forms than before, than they were in the 90s. So we just wanted to see what those signatures are and what the future holds for us. Back to you.
Right. And I think something that I want to highlight about some of the impacts, because this really sat with me when I was studying this material and doing some research on this. There's so many academic papers, I want to say also. If you're interested in studying this, the SAPs had a real problem on regional economies in lesser wealthy nations is not a secret. The World Bank is very aware of this. What they have done in response, that's some of the continuing questions we have in this particular group. But there are many academics and economists who have worked to try and understand what's going on. And there have been these four buckets that have, come up time and time again, that even if we see, yes, GDP rose. However, it's always the however. There's usually a good paragraph, 2 paragraphs about like the ultimate target, which was to make sure these nations paid back the money that they borrowed. That was the priority. You pay back the money that you borrow, sometimes at very low interest rates, but it needs to get paid back. So there was, a lot of howevers that needed to be accounted for. So with reduction in public spending on health, education, social welfare, we started to see health outcomes for women in particular, really suffer as a result of SAPs. And you have to remember that the changes to the economies that are being done under the name of SAPs, they aren't something you can undo in a year or two or within administration. It will take an entire generation to almost flush out the effects of something, just to start maybe somewhere new, but even that new generation is inheriting the realities of their former generation. So it takes multiple cycles before we can really say that we're on new footing. We also have to question, this infringement of economic sovereignty. That is a question, what happens when you take economic sovereignty from a nation, give it money and say, now I'm going to be the decider in how your markets run, how your economy is structured. And so what we also get is not only the issue, yes, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. That was one book that I read in this year, Lynn, and really I think is a great one by John Perkins. One thing that comes up with SAPs also is, since we've liberalized prices, we've opened you up to the international market, you might need a little help, right? But don't worry, we have all the connections you need, and sometimes forced partnerships were pushed down. So not only did the creditor nations earn money off of the interest that was coming through, and also earn something in terms of soft power by changing the economic realities of a nation to fit your own hegemonic interests. We're now also, we have a direct channel to push our suppliers who are ready to hit your every need right here, right now, and create a situation of dependency, one-way dependency as well. And then, without much surprise, this led to more unsustainable economic outcomes for the common person. It increased unemployment across sub-Saharan Africa and deepened the wealth inequality for locals. Now, Liz, you had made a point that in Asia, some of these programs were more efficient and effective, but you draw a comparison to the manufacturing economy of those Asian nations. Can you speak to that for just a moment?
I think the reason like the manufacturing and industrialization worked was because it's all about the value chain, right? A lot of these Asian countries were able to control, and not really control, but they were present in all factors of the value chain. Whereas in a lot of African countries, after we produced the raw materials and it was sent out, that was it. A lot of times we only came back into the value chain as end users of the commodity, where it was sold back to us. In also in forms that don't really work for us. If you're talking about like nutritional value, if it's like an agricultural product, or even in clothing, because then that led to the decimation of like local industries in a lot of these countries. So, oh, sorry, Njoki also wants to add something. This is her passion.
I just wanted to add that it's important to remember that one of the main income earners via colonialism was to be able to get raw materials at very, very subsidized rates because of underpaying the labor required, getting subsidies from the colonizer governments, going towards whether it was settler farmers or whoever, the miners, people like that, and making sure that it's very, very easy for business interests to be able to extract these raw materials at very, very reduced costs, being able to move those so that all of the value added and all of the profit accrued from that value addition go directly to the colonizer interests. So that was why there was no real way to even consider beginning sustainable manufacturing in Africa. And this continues to this day, because the minute you do that, then the threat of equalizing and reducing incomes for now, quote unquote, former colonizing interests really becomes a big thing.
Right. Well, let's take a look at an example of an economy that was a primary, exporter of rice, for instance. Njoki, I know that you have something to share about the Ghanaian rice trade and how the SAPs program impacted Ghanaian independence here.
Absolutely. It's a really, really kind of sad story, because looking back at it now, you find it very difficult to imagine that the people who instituted these SAPs did not foresee this outcome. And so I think for me, when you look at it from this side, you can really kind of see an image of malice aforethought, even though nobody would be able to say say that they agree, especially in economic context. They can say, oh, there's many other ways this could have worked out. Maybe they're right, but like for me, I don't see it that way. So what happened was that in 1983 is when they just kind of started to institute the structural adjustment programs in Ghana, and specifically with regard to the rice trade. They decided that they needed to just kind of contain spending on local rice growth. And because they didn't really see it as an efficient sector yet. So they said, listen, just forget all of this work that you're doing on your local rice. It's not working for you. And also you're just kind of hemorrhaging anything that you're earning on this rice, trying to make this rice of yours work. So other people have figured out rice. Let's get rice from them. That's going to be more efficient. For you guys, let's focus on trying to get you to be able to pay back your debts, right? So it's like somebody coming into your house and telling you, we don't like that you have a TV. Maybe you can be walking to your neighbor and watching the TV there. But then we can sell this TV that you have in your house so that we can be able to kind of pay back your debts. Essentially, that's kind of what was happening. So obviously this worked against farmers, because the farmers of rice, because any subsidies that they were enjoying before were withdrawn. So any subsidies they had as regards fertilizer, as regards inputs, with their farming, all of those were gone. The price controls that the government had instituted, absolutely gone. All of the state entities that had been set up to be able to grow this rice sector, all gone. They had been sent to private sector, whose only job is to make profit, not to be able to grow the sector fast, right? Because a government is not an entity that's set up to profit here, even though, of course, in these neoliberal ages, this has kind of shifted. But at that point in time, that was not the aim of a government. It was just kind of to be able to take care of the people in whatever way they saw best. So now when all of this happened, a lot of commercial rice farmers said it doesn't make sense to farm rice in these wildly unfriendly and hostile circumstances. So they kind of disengaged from the sector. So obviously the sector then shrunk. What ended up happening, of course, was that people still wanted rice. So folks started importing rice in very large numbers. And so during those years, the percentage import of rice went up significantly. And then, of course, the imported rice was coming at a much lower price than the local rice was available at. So the demand for this imported rice grew, which then favored the distribution also of this imported rice. So a lot of entities kind of rose up, especially in the private sector, to be able to facilitate the distribution of this rice. So this market of imported rice really, really increased. And you can imagine the effects that this had on the local rice industry. And so Ghana's status as a rice exporter, because before all of this, it wasn't exporting that much, but it was exporting some rice. Of course, that status was going to stay because fewer people are farming rice. It's become far more expensive for them to farm rice than it was before. And so, of course, that weakens the economic position because they're not trading as much. When you sell things outside of your border, you're getting in foreign exchange directly that belongs just to you. So now you have less that you can trade with to be able to earn this money. And then remember that you're paying back debts on top of all of this, right? And then you're spending money to be able to buy all of these rice imports. So then imports, you're spending forex to do that. There's exposure, of course, to global markets, which then means that if anything happens in these countries where you're importing rice from, there's going to be problems that will also reflect back on you. And we also saw this happening during COVID, when they also announced the war in Russia and Ukraine, who provide a lot of oil, a lot of fertilizer for everywhere in the world. Everything shifted for everybody. And that's what this is kind of regarding. When the people you're importing things from have challenges, those challenges are going to be experienced by you in very direct ways. And then, of course, there was significantly reduced development of the local rice industry, which of course impacted rural livelihoods directly. So all of these people who used to farm rice, they were making money farming rice, that's completely cut off in many ways. And then this, of course, undermined Ghana's economic resilience and their internal food self-sufficiency. You're relying on this rice that you're importing from outside, and you're not kind of self-sufficient as regards your own food anymore. So this is kind of what happened as regards the SAPs in Ghana.
Right. And then, what ends up happening now is that, this was an SAP was supposed to promote economic efficiency, but it effectively just made Ghana more independent, or sorry, more dependent rather, and less food sufficient on its own. And there was no plan. What do we do with these farmers who have abandoned the rice trade now? And, what are we doing here to take care of them? We're going to switch gears here a little bit to kind of talk about Kenya joining the World Bank and take a look at some case studies related to Kenya. This is the chart for the full moon that preceded Kenya joining as a member country to the World Bank. It's good to keep in mind that Kenya became an independent nation separate from Britain colonial rule just before this. So this is a very quick kind of, all part of this very massively transformative experience that was happening in Kenya at the time. You can see that there's a Uranus-Pluto conjunction in the midheaven. It's a very it's a very stark conjunction. Both of these planets are retrograde, and they give, I think, a bit of an indication of the the signs of the times and what was going in to roles in political office in the 60s. What strikes me looking at this chart is the opposition that the moon forms to both Mars and Saturn, and the moon being in the 9th house. So there is, I think, with this image here of the moon ruling the 8th, which is a house of debt, in the 9th house, taking on foreign debt in opposition to Mars and Saturn. Mars and Saturn together can be quite a powerful couple in terms of industrializing. Or building infrastructure. Aquarius in particular has close connection to infrastructure development because Aquarius is associated with kind of conforming the land to fit needs for human civilization. It's very frequently talked about in the historical texts about its connections with water, finding sources of water, building conduits and aqueducts, but also Aquarius, because of its Saturnian influence, describes mines and things that are also built into the earth to support local infrastructure as well. And you can see, with that conjunction, that there, and the moon's opposition to both, and the sun applying to both as well, there's a bit of, kind of intensity and some brashness and some, harsh realities that are likely to come on the back of that. There is a sextile between Mercury in the 2nd and Venus in the 4th, and I think, taking a look at that and Mars making an application to Jupiter, that it could be argued that you will be able to find stories where there are pictures and vignettes of success of injection of capital into Kenya, just like you'll find anywhere. It's the broader story when you zoom out, where you understand how everything features together, that you realize you can't just take Mercury sextile Venus, moon trine Jupiter, sun applying to Mars, applying to the sextile Jupiter on its own. We have to remember that it's also Mercury in square with Jupiter, the moon in opposition to Mars, Uranus up on the midheaven, 8th ruler in the 9th, south node on the 2nd. So we get this image, I think, fairly quickly, that the strain is really focused on financial difficulties and pressure. The chart on the outside now is the chart for Kenyan independence. So you can see that it really was, just a couple of months later. It was in December of 63, 64, when Kenya earned its independence. claimed its independence. And this Mars-Mercury South Node conjunction, Venus, all of this pressure is placed in this second house, this World Bank second house. Look, I think this is kind of building up, the story here about the golden handcuffs that come with the World Bank's intervention, particularly in Kenya. We have some examples here, Liz and Njoki. I'll pass it to you to talk about the SAP program and its relation to the education crisis experienced in Kenya.
So in the push to have more efficiency, especially around the provision of public goods, because of the SAPs, university education mainly did away with a lot of the cushioning that it had provided students in terms of subsidized housing. They used to be paid like a stipend, I think, per semester, that not only allowed the students to support themselves, but because it was quite significant, also allowed them to support their families back home. A lot of the students in the post-colonial time of students joining like Kenyan public universities were very much from poorer income rural areas. So this, as it was called, a boom, really did like make a difference in transforming the lives of families even before the student joined like the working class. And in order to deal with to make the system more efficient, they did away with the boom. They did away with a lot of the cushioning. They increased the fees, the university fees. And of course, this meant that a lot of students who had earned good grades were then locked out of the system. And the government also introduced like a pay your way kind of system that was known as Module 2, where they offered the same courses that were deemed like very prestigious, lucrative, engineering, medicine, law, at a much higher cost, up to I think 5 times per semester, in regards to what students were already paying, and reduced grades so that they could get more people into the education system, so that then the public universities were able to sustain themselves now that they no longer had access to government resources. So we then went into this, like if you see the figure on the screen, the number of university students on paper went up, but it was only the private students that led to this increase in numbers. So this can look like a success story of the SAPs program, but when you dig into it further, you can see that it then led to more like students who had like earned their way no longer had access. This also meant that after like their life outcomes were then significantly impacted. Njoki, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add about this.
Yeah, maybe just to kind of point out that in Kenya, we don't have as big an economy as many other countries. And so it makes sense in a lot of countries to imagine a student kind of earning their way through school. It doesn't work that well here because, first of all, we have a very, very low minimum wage, which is viewed from a monthly perspective. It's almost about $100 per month, roughly, which you can imagine, like if you look at it from a per week perspective, is really, really a low amount of money. And then even those minimum wage jobs, and that you can't enforce minimum wage in this country, even those minimum wage jobs, there's not enough of them. We don't have a 24-hour economy. We don't have a huge kind of retail and service kind of context, whether it's like garment retail, food retail, things like that. And so there's almost no way to be able to have both enough money to live in a very expensive town, as well as to have money to be able to send home for your family. So it really kind of reduced the quality of life for students significantly to be able to lose that government subsidy, both on their fees and on their kind of life expenses.
Yeah. Thank you. I know that we also have an education case study here, or sorry, continuing the education case study here with the IFC, which is another body. Just to remind everybody, the IFC's responsibility. The IFC, International Finance Corporation, is part of the World Bank Group, and it facilitates private sector investment. So this is a particular case study related to what happens when private sector money and privatization interacts with, what might might have been considered a service or a public service in other contexts. So Liz, tell us a little bit about what happened here with the bridge schools in Kenya.
Okay, so the bridge schools were a solution pushed to a lot of African countries, many African countries, to fill the gap of not enough public schools, not enough teachers. And the IFC was one of the key private investors into the bridge academies. Another investor was, I think, Meta, known as Facebook back then. But then for the case of Bridge, these private schools were set up in Kenya, mostly low-income areas where the teachers who were hired were not necessarily qualified through like the Kenyan teacher training system. I think the minimum requirement was like some sort of higher education, maybe a degree, and that you're able to easily navigate like their curriculum that was in a tablet. So there's no there's no teacher training, there's no focus on education, there's no education, I mean, no focus on the well-being of the students. It's push this product, get as many parents to sign up to push this product so that you can make a good case for the investment, for the numbers. Now, unfortunately, because the approach and the focus was not on quality education, there have been several cases of sexual abuse within the system, and in these low-income areas where a lot of times cases of sexual abuse are ignored, or the parents do not have the means and resources to follow up with the authorities, with the police, with the judicial system. It has continued going on basically without much legal intervention, until there was a case like a few years ago, where too many cases by the same teacher who was moved around in different various schools, then led to an investigation that then led to the questioning of this bridge system as like, does it really take the well-being of its students or the communities that it's serving seriously? Because then anytime they tried to go to the police or go through the judicial system, like financial backing of Bridge then came through to, force the silences of these students, force the silences of their families. And it's just been a disaster in terms of how it's been managed. And it's been managed more as a PR crisis than really dealing with the fundamental issues that are at the root of, you cannot have a quasi-private institution delivering public goods and it cannot be held accountable to the same standards. And it cannot go through the same accountability systems that everything else is taken through just because it's in the service of capital. Njoki, is there anything you'd like to?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Well, I guess I can add something. Then we'll take a look at the compliance advisor ombudsman produced an impartial report investigating the claims and working to understand exactly what was put forward against the World Bank and the IFC. And this is the chart. This is the new moon that was just a couple of days before the report was published. And it has, all of the signatures that you would kind of expect for, there is responsibility on these organizations. There is responsibility here, gross neglect. And in fact, that it required, this much work for it to be resolved, also as a secondary and concurrent issue, that there's just isn't a vehicle to resolve these issues at the right level for the reasons that Liz mentioned. The focus is on the financial product that's being sold, not on the quality of outcome. And so this is, it puts a strain up against the system to have two masters in name that are being served when only one of them is being served in practice. Now, this particular chart, the themes that I want to focus on, Venus and Scorpio in the 9th house, the International Financing Corporation, and the private lending that was coming through, the direct lending that was coming through private organizations. So there's something being shown here with the ninth house possibly connected to education. I understand that that's not so much grade school education, but the ninth house certainly is foreign investment and foreign interference. Venus in the final degrees of Scorpio. This will be in the terms of Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Scorpio. That signature is very frequently reported when we're talking about themes of sexual abuse or sexual fault, or in some way an objectification of the human body. And Venus, you can see, is moving towards contact with Jupiter and Saturn. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that is just about to perfect on the other side of the sign boundary. So there's almost this symbolism here too that, you know, this is a reminder of the system that's been set up in the reality of what this has been and has always been. And maybe the promise of Jupiter and Saturn perfecting the conjunction on the other side of the sign boundary indicates that other options are accessible to us, other options are possible, but that sextile did perfect, before there was that sign change. And you can also notice here that Jupiter ruling the midheaven in the 12th in its sign of fall in Capricorn, conjunct Saturn, also shows gross neglect on the part of the administrative body heading up bridge schools. Same thing with the South Node in the midheaven, conjunct Mercury in Sagittarius, very close to the Sun-Saturn conjunction. So there's a lot, to kind of see here. The thing about the SAPs that have been, so difficult is like really kind of dislodging yourself from reliance on these systems is difficult. But Kenya has, really led the way in trying to find new ways to raise revenue that allow, Kenyan's own economic sovereignty to be at the center and Kenyan outcomes to be at the center. In 2009, the Kenyan government issued infrastructure bonds that were meant to finance various development projects. It's very difficult to get reporting about where that bond money was spent. And, reporting is something that is challenging to get, consistently for things on this kind of scale. But we understand that this money was put towards roads, bridges, energy projects. There was quite a lot of money that was raised. And what this is a direct investment into Kenyan infrastructure and Kenyan growth and Kenyan development. And it shows, a very different way forward where, the promise of what Kenya is capable of becoming is more enticing than the promise of what an SAP can turn the Kenyan economy into in the long run. And that's what's being shown. So there was a more recent issuance of infrastructure bonds in 2023. About 50 billion Kenyan shillings were floated. And that's about 500 million in US dollars. And it was a 17-year tax-free instrument that was traded on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. And it filled, a really important gap in terms of funding important development projects for Kenya. So this is the environment in which we'll come now to the final slides of our presentation. This is now the scenario in which we have a new World Bank president come in. We are dealing with the sexual assault cases. We are dealing with the recognition that the legacy of the structured adjustment programs is by no means behind us. Even today, when money is issued from the World Bank, it comes with conditions. That is a structurally adjusted program, even if it is not called such a thing. When we are telling you that to accept this money, you will restructure your economy in this way. You may have your own arguments about how wise that is, but we're just making the point that this is a continuing theme and they're not a thing of the past. This is A.J. Benga, who became the 14th president of the World Bank in June of last year. He is the first World Bank president that was born in the global South. Now, just to remind you, the World Bank was the U.S. institution. The IMF was the Europe-based institution. So Keynes wanted the IMF and White wanted the World Bank. The World Bank has always had an American president, and the IMF has always had a European president, and they are right across the street from each other in DC. So they are based in the United States. AJ Benga is an American. Oh, Sorry for my fireworks. AJ Banga is an American citizen, but he was born in India. But he's facing a significant moment in terms of management of the World Bank. There's a lot of questions about the bank's investment arm, the International Finance Corporation, and the chain of schools in Kenya, the bridge schools, for instance. And then, we have to also take into consideration that AJ Banga, he comes from a long, deep corporate history working with MasterCard. He has not worked in the public sector. He has not worked in anything that's measuring social outcomes. He is a man who measures things in terms of financial and real capital. And so I don't know if this really signals the kind of shift that we're looking for. It feels to me like this is a continuation of the same. There's a lot, if you read the articles about AJ Banga's coming into this position, there's commentary about how we're optimistic about Biden's selection for AJ Banga because of his commitment to climate change. We don't really know where that's coming from. You try to chase that down, there's nothing except for a nod that climate change is important. What seems to have happened is that Trump's selection for the World Bank president, who is no longer in office and AJ Banga replaced him, was a climate change denier. And so as a result, his policies within the World Bank reflected that. And a lot of the member nations within the World Bank challenged the direction the World Bank was headed under his leadership. AJ Banga, is more on side with climate ideology, at least if nothing else for the optics, right? And we have that kind of conversation. Taking a look at this chart, you might recognize this. This is from last year. There's that Sun-Moon conjunction heading towards a sextile with Mars in the 12th. The problem, this is a loaded chart because this Mars, Jupiter, Pluto T-square that's being formed, and the moon and the sun are heading, into configuration with those planets. The sun and moon are headed towards both Pluto and Mars. And we have to consider that the 2024 Aries ingress has the moon in Leo opposing Pluto in the early degrees of Aquarius, very early. So it's triggering what's happening with AJ Banga's his ascension into this organization. When we contrast his birth chart against the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction that preceded the World Bank's founding, so the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction was at 9 degrees of Taurus in 1941. It just so happens that that conjunction is, now bang on the midheaven of the lunation that brought Banga into the presidency of the World Bank. And there's quite a lot of signatures here that are reflecting, Pluto is reaching in opposition to that point, so we'll have the Pluto opposition with Pluto in Aquarius, Pluto in early Leo, and then that really triggering Banga's Jupiter-Mars Pluto opposition. So it just seems to me that we are in a time of, very stark reckoning for the bank, and that it is becoming increasingly unpopular. It had a real challenge, public outcry coming out of the 80s and 90s, and a lot of academic work questioning the effectiveness of the World Bank. Mind you, a lot of times these reports are written with somebody from the World Bank as an advisor, right there next to you. But now, it seems that nations are finding other ways to fund what they need doing. Infrastructure bonds. We have Brazil, South Africa, Russia, India, China coming together to form their own structure. China and its own, infrastructure lending across the African continent is, so there's a lot really, I think, to look at and to pay attention to. Tell me a little bit, Elizabeth and Njoki, just in closing, is there anything you'd like to add about, what we're looking at with AJ Banga and the near-term future with the World Bank?
Maybe I can go. One of the things that happened with the SAPs is that their optics are horrible. And so what ended up happening was the World Bank at some point decided, let's just kind of get individual countries to have a little bit more input into what we say about them, which of course is a response to these really bad optics. And so countries were invited to kind of contribute, again, like Wade said, those you give these opinions with the World Bank and the IMF kind of sitting over your shoulder and watching what you write. But essentially, experts from the country as well as experts from the World Bank and the IMF collaborate to write what they call poverty reduction strategy papers, which are, just kind of explorations into how it is possible to reduce the effects of poverty on the individuals living on the country. One of the critiques of the SAPs was that they were very kind of high-minded and didn't really think about the human beings who are going to suffer, especially the immediate and short-term effects of these SAPs. And so the poverty reduction strategy papers are supposed to kind of address that. There's not any real push to make anything in the poverty reduction strategy papers real, even though countries are very faithful in being able to submit updates. We've done a little bit more research. We are doing a little bit more monitoring. On the ground, it's not necessarily translating. And like Liz said earlier, you still kind of see the specter of SAPs hanging over the kind of debt that countries, especially the global majority, are having to take. Maybe Liz, you can say something else.
No, I don't think I have anything to add. Just to summarize that this new round of structural adjustment facilities and effects that we're facing is even worse because we've barely recovered from the ones in the 80s and the 90s. So it's like adding salt to an injury. And I think also, compounded with like the other global crises that are happening, it's very hard to see like a very hopeful way out of it. But I do like that someone in the comment section said that there's a youth explosion, youth boom that is coming, that is going to, overturn how Africa then responds to these types of situations in the future in a more hopeful manner. So I really look forward to that. And thank you for the person who put that in the comment section.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's very easy to see these things from very dire kind of points of view. So a sprinkle of hope is always really nice. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much to Liz and Njoki. This was, I think a riveting walk through the history of the World Bank and structural adjustment. I'm very appreciative of the time that we had together researching and pulling this together. And would like to say thank you very much for joining us at the World Astrology Summit. Okay, everybody, what we're going to do now, we're going to go ahead and close the room. And we will reopen it so we can welcome Rod Chang to the World Astrology Summit, where he'll be presenting Trouble Brewing in East Asia. So I'm going to close the room, save the recording, and open this back up. Thank you all so much. Liz and Njoki, thank you. Much appreciated. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.